Hey everybody, I'm Nick Kolakowski, the host of Tech Connects, where we dig into all aspects of the tech industry and tech recruiting that matter to you. For our latest episode, I'm chatting with Danny Thompson, who's the Director of Technology at This Dot Labs. He's also a frequent speaker on tech hiring, a conference organizer, and a podcast host. He's constantly talking to recruiters, hiring experts, and people in the developer community about what it takes to land a job in tech. And I thought it'd be great to sit down with him and break down what the hiring landscape looks like right now for software developers and engineers. Even better, he has some great tips for anyone who's navigating the tech landscape right now in search of a job. So let's jump in. So let's just begin by, for the listeners, for the tech pros who are listening to this or watching this on YouTube, who might not be familiar with you as a speaker, as a recruiting expert and as a developer. If you could just give us kind of a brief rundown of your background, I think that'd be fantastic just before we jump into everything.
Yeah, my name is Danny Thompson. I'm the Director of Technology at a company called This Dot Labs. I started traditionally as a software developer, kind of growing up the ranks. But for me, before I ever entered tech, I was frying chicken in a gas station, and learning how to code completely changed my life. It didn't just change my life in the sense that we're making more money and things like that, but it let me understand a lot of things. Number one, the kind of generational shift that you can make when you learn a skill that's actually in demand for the market. And that by itself, like one thing that I've noticed recently is my son, who's at the age of 11, is at a starting point now that exceeds the position I was at even at the age of 25. And so these are things that I'm constantly thinking about. And so at this point, I've helped thousands land jobs in tech. It's kind of, I don't really monetize it. It's honestly, I enjoy it, but partially because I know what it did for me. So I know what it can potentially do for others. And so for me, this entire journey started with learning how to code, getting involved, getting part of communities. To be honest, that's kind of what got me addicted to the process. And one really interesting thing was in tech, at least, it seemed like a lot of people were enthusiastic to help you. Whereas when you come from retail, business, or working in lower retail positions where the income is lower, people are really into like trying to one up another individual, right? They're more than happy to like dunk on you, or the adage that I heard years and years, if you got time to lean, you got time to clean. They never said something like, oh, take a breather, think about this. And so when I was going to all these meetups and events, I really enjoyed that difference in approach of people, and that's kind of what it still leads me to leading events to this day. I'm in Dallas, Texas now, and we lead some of the largest meetups and most active meetup groups in the city of Dallas. We just actually held a conference as well very recently, the Commit Your Code conference for charity. It was supposed to be a one and done thing. The idea was really just to kind of reinvigorate the communities and the Dallas tech community, but it was such a big success where we donated everything to charity. People felt great about that. We had some great food. We had 64 speakers. We went all out. And even in my keynote, I said, we're only doing this one time, but I'll never do it again, because I gave myself a challenge to do a tech conference in a very short period of time. We planned the whole thing out in less than 3 months, and it went really, really well. But at the end, so many people asked for it that the last 20 minutes of the conference, I decided, let's go ahead and do it again. And so I announced it, and the cheers were so loud, we set off the alarm system. I wasn't even expecting that. That was on another level, and I was so happy that happened. So we're doing it again this September. So if anyone listening wants to attend, our tickets start at $30, because I'm a very big believer in tech should be accessible for everyone. And it's looking like we're going to have somewhere in the ballpark of almost 100 speakers for this. So it's definitely going to be large. It's going to be impactful. But for me, a big passion of mine is engineering. I'm the Director of Technology at This Dot Labs. So This Dot Labs is a tech consultancy. We work with companies like Google, Microsoft, Stripe, MailChimp, etc. But on top of that, we have a media arm as well. So we have 2 podcasts that are very, very successful, one of which is the Modern Web Podcast. It's very, very popular in the world of JavaScript. And then we have another podcast that is called The Leadership Exchange, where we interview C-suite executives or leadership executives from organizations all over the world, kind of on the business side of things. So if you're looking for a more business-focused podcast, that might be interesting. If you're looking for a technical one, Modern Web might be the fit for that. And then, of course, lastly, sorry, I got a long list. I could just go do so much.
It's amazing. It's right back in. It's just like every moment you're moving.
The last thing is I am one of the hosts for the podcast that is called the Programming Podcast with my very, very good friend Leon Noel, the founder of 100 Devs and also the managing director of Resilient Coders. And so we somehow made this podcast, which started as a joke and has turned into this whole new thing. But we are like a top ranked podcast in the US and UK. And so we talk a lot about not just programming. We do programming podcast episodes, but also from the hiring standpoint. What sets you to stand out? How do you get your own freelance clients if you're a technical developer and things like that? So our goal is to help people land opportunities, whether it's something that they want on their own or working for an organization. And for me, a lot of my conversational points and ideas stem from the idea of enterprise level, where his stems from startup. So we sometimes get in debates because of the differences of opinions, which is always good for conversation. But at the very least, you'll walk away with some new ideas.
Yeah, I can see. I mean, the startup versus enterprise dichotomy is a really interesting one, just because obviously somebody who's sort of enmeshed in the enormous like mothership of a company versus somebody who's trying to kind of scrape it together with five people. It's interesting. I just last week I did a huge Reddit AMA on CS career questions with a lot of people who are participating in this are people who were where you were, in the sense that they're working a completely different job, and a lot of them are trying to break into tech. Some of them are in school, some of them are not. And they're getting all sorts of advice flooded at them constantly. People are saying, like, spin up tons of projects on GitHub and then impress a hiring manager that way. And other people are saying, oh, you got to get a degree or you're never going to get anywhere, et cetera. And there's a lot of confusion because it's almost like over information. And so when you're talking to people who are coming to you, obviously, as an expert, and they want insight into, oh God, where do I start? How do I get out of whatever job I'm doing now in retail or whatever, and then break into software? What do you tell them? I mean, what do you think is actually effective versus things that people just sort of say as advice, but doesn't really actually work?
Yeah, the problem with this is all of this advice is worth all the money that you didn't pay for it, right? Like there's no barrier to entry when it comes to someone offering some kind of advice. And because of that, you get all differing perspectives. There's a lot of developers out there that don't know what advice actually works. But because they found themselves in the right conversation at the right time, things panned out for them. And so a lot of stars have to align in order for something like that to happen. So for me, in the nicest way possible, a lot of this advice is bad, but I don't think it has necessarily bad intentions behind it. I think they have good intentions. They just don't necessarily know what really actually works for a lot of these organizations. And so for me, there's a lot of strategies that come into play when it comes to getting a role. And the first thing that I always preface this with is, even if I'm saying it, some influencer, don't take what they're saying just because they have a large following, right? Follower metric does not necessarily guarantee that a person is an authority on a subject. It just means they run their mouth on that app a lot. And so people hit the follow button on them a little bit more than the others. So for me, I'm popular, I guess, on a couple platforms. And because of that, I end up running my mouth a little bit more on those platforms. So please, whatever you hear on this or from any influencer or any authority, whatever it may be, do your research and see how it applies to you before you do that. Because at the end of the day, a lot of this advice, and this is kind of my problem with people giving advice, these are things that people are going to take to heart and do career transitions on, or they're going to literally alter their strategy to see if this works, and it costs them time. And I'm a very big believer in value for time. So please make sure this works for you before you actually implement it. But when it comes to like trying to transition, one of the biggest things that a lot of people don't think about is your ability to de-risk yourself as a candidate. That is like your number one goal. And everything that stems from that, like that's the top of the tree and everything else is a branch after that, right? So it's like, how do you de-risk yourself? Because the way that I always equate it is you are essentially, especially if you're trying to get your first job in tech, or to be honest, even if you're getting your third, you are an investment, you're a stock. Companies do not like taking risky investments. If anything, they like taking the most safest bet possible that has a return on it. And so your focus should be, what can I do to de-risk myself in such a way to where they're like, this is worth taking the opportunity on. And so when you are someone that doesn't have experience in tech, for example, you need to start thinking on things like, what can I showcase? I can't just say, well, I work at Starbucks and I'm trying to transition and they should just take a chance on me. companies aren't necessarily in the business of doing charity, including charities. They're in the business of building that business out to the best way possible. And so if anyone is going to take a chance on you, it's going to be because you've done something or showcased something in such a way that they're like, there's something here. And so you should be thinking about, what does that look like to you? What are the things that when you're writing your resume or you're writing your LinkedIn profile or even sending a DM to somebody, what are the hooks? What are the things that pique interest to the point where someone's like, I need to get into a conversation with this person to find out more. And then, because to me, this is a big thing. When it comes to your LinkedIn or your resume, don't just look at this like it's a checkbox item on a to-do list. You should be thinking more strategically, like, what conversation do I want someone to have with me after they read this resume? Like, what does it look like? What do I want them to walk away with knowing now that they've read this? To be honest, majority of the one-on-ones I have with people, these are things that never enter their mind. Like, if I just read your experience, let me take one step back to explain this point further. When you look at your resume, the strategy that I think about when it comes to my resume is, they're going to read this. And because they're reading this, it means I applied to something or I networked with somebody in such a way that they're like, I need to potentially interview Danny for a role. And so for me, I'm like, I know that as soon as they had that thought, they didn't hire a private investigator to be like, go find out everything about Danny Thompson. I need to know everything. No, they got my LinkedIn and my resume because that's all I gave them. So because that's all I gave them, that is the only area that they have to develop questions for that interview process to take place with. So that's where they're going to source everything. And if I don't over deliver on the information, then it takes me to an area where they may ask me something generic or unexpected, where I don't necessarily know where that conversation is going to go. So when it comes to my experience, I'm often thinking, I'm listing out these points in such a way to where it's like, now, what do I want them to ask me? What do I want them to walk away with knowing about me, to where they're like, okay, let's have a conversation on this. And so for me, that is often my goal. Like, if I'm giving my LinkedIn or my resume, it's like, we're having a conversation on these topics. What does that conversation look like? And I want to kind of gear it in that direction of where I feel strongest, because if it's in the area where I feel most confident and most secure, I'm winning that conversation every single time. But if you take me into an area where I have to say, actually, I don't know that, I know this instead, or, oh, I've never done that, but I've done this instead. There's only so many of those back and forth to where you're like, oh, Danny doesn't have exactly what I'm looking for.
Yeah. It's interesting to me, and you actually mentioned this in a social media post at some point a couple of months ago, and I thought this was a really good take, and it's also something that really sort of seems to bother a lot of people, especially kind of more junior developers as they're applying for jobs, which is obviously the first round of the resume is being read by a hiring manager or a recruiter who doesn't necessarily have a tech background. I mean, they can differentiate Java from JavaScript. But then beyond that, if you survive that, you get to, and this is obviously after you've survived the automated resume screen, but then after that, you get to the level where you're talking to somebody more technical, or you go to a panel interview where you're facing like the company's developers and a horrible 5-hour like marathon of coding. But so a lot of junior developers, when I talk to them, they get weirded out because they're like, okay, like I'm developing this resume, to your point in LinkedIn, to try to kind of provoke these questions and get in there. But I'm afraid that, how do I survive sort of this initial round with somebody who's non-technical in order to get in front of the person who can truly appreciate like the technical skills or the project I've built or my repo or whatever they have that sort of shows that out. And so that dichotomy seems to really bother them, like how you get past the non-technical to the technical. And what's your take on that? Because you've written about this. It's an interesting thing to kind of navigate.
Yeah, this is one of the most common things that I even see. And this is not even at a junior level, to be honest with you. This is even when I'm talking to engineering managers or directors. They're so focused on interviews number 3 and 4 that they forget interview number 1 exists. And so they're so focused on these technical ones that when they enter a conversation with a non-technical individual, they have almost no idea how to explain their technical achievements in such a way that that non-technical person actually becomes enthusiastic about what they're talking about. And to be honest with you, of the thousands of hiring managers and recruiters and people in HR that I've talked to over the years, they say the exact same thing. They're talking about things that I have no clue what they're even expressing, but they haven't considered me in this process. So the way that I look at the interview processes is, number one, the screening person is that HR individual, that corporate recruiter, internal recruiter, external recruiter. And I often equate them not in a malicious way, but to bus drivers. Their goal is that they've been given a job description and they're trying to find as many people as possible that match this criteria and drive them to a destination with the hopes that some of them end up getting a seat in that organization, because that is how they monetize this relationship. They don't get paid for responding to your LinkedIn DMs, for your emails. It's transactional. So now that you understand how their position is, you should understand how to use it to your leveraging point as well. Because as a candidate, you should be thinking, okay, I understand that to a certain degree, they definitely want to help me out. But at the end of the day, they're having 400 conversations a week, right? So there's no way that they're going to be able to answer every single little request that I have. But if I'm not a fit for this, I should just be like, okay, on to the next one. Or how can I have multiple conversations to see like where I stand within that marketplace for what it is that they're hiring for? Oftentimes, I'll even get responses from people where they're like, oh, this random recruiter reached out to me for something that I don't even get a match with. And I just got so angry, I went off in the DMs. I'm like, for what?
Yeah.
Whenever that happens to me, I'm like, hey, I'm not a match for ABC, but I'm a better match for DEF and XYZ. Here's my resume. Keep it on file for if you get something like that. I'd love to have that conversation when that comes around. Do you know how many times that has actually done something favorable for me in the long term? A lot of people think very short term in that mindset, and they don't necessarily know how to leverage that after the fact. But when it comes to interview number one, you should be thinking about how do you explain your achievements and your individual contributions in such a way that the person in interview number one loves you so much that they're enthusiastic in their note taking and their recommendation for interview number two to the person that will be over interview number two. That is the way that I think about it. Because for me, they're taking notes in that thing, right? So they're going to have what, maybe 100 interviews, 50 interviews. Give them something so exciting that when they review those notes again, they're like, oh yeah, of course we're going to interview this person again. That should be the strategy that you're thinking about in every single round, whether it's 1 to 4, 5, 8, whatever the organization is doing.
It seems that it's also a good opportunity where, I mean, you constantly see people talking about, you got to go into soft skills. You got to emphasize your ability to work within teams, to lead teams, depending on kind of where you are in your career and so on. So it seems like that's a good opportunity to do that, where if you're talking, during your first interview round, like, because it's also a culture fit too. So you want to be like, okay, I can fit in the culture. I've got empathy. I've got communication. I can like segue in, and then, hopefully that then helps advance you to like that kind of that more technical round. Hopefully.
It's interesting. Like for me, when it comes to like soft skill items, I feel like, especially in interview number one, your focus shouldn't necessarily be on telling them what they are. It should be using them in a demonstrable way. So if if you say you have good communication, but you're being very quiet within that interview, that's not demonstrating your soft skill. Or if you have the ability to take a request and translate it into something else, like a business requirement to a technical requirement, I would be trying to demonstrate that in a way that the non-technical person can kind of pick up on that. These are things that I'm often saying that should be your strategy. Like showcase more than explain. Or, for example, I'm very particular on this. If you put the words detail oriented anywhere on your LinkedIn or your resume, I'm now looking at the details. If you omit it, I may not. So if you have obvious mistakes, this really scratches my skin, because you yourself said you're detail oriented and you yourself are presenting a document that you had your entire life to finally say, this is the moment where I feel it's worth actually handing out instead of rushing through. And this is how you're kind of contradicting yourself. I feel like if you're saying that, there's nothing wrong with it. Maybe you are very detail oriented when it comes to projects, but why are you devaluing yourself in that process to not be detail oriented with the things that you're creating for yourself? Really take the time and execute properly, and you'll see favorable results in that regard.
Yeah, that's always the joke where you write detail oriented, but there's a typo in the phrase.
Mm-hmm.
That's always kind of the issue. I guess, I mean, the other thing that I wanted to talk to you about, I mean, there's a lot of, especially since Meta announced some layoffs this week, to supposedly invest more in AI systems. You know where I'm going with this. I mean, there's a lot of fear out there around AI. And of course, developers know that, there's a creativity in development, and, a bot that's spitting out whatever it's learned from scraping the internet is not going to be able to replicate somebody who can look at a tech stack and be like, okay, we need to write this specific code to address this or whatever. But there's still this fear that AI is going to kind of rip out jobs wholesale, and that software developers aren't going to be have the same opportunities in 5 years that they maybe necessarily do now. How do you feel about that? Because I talk to people all the time, and everyone's opinions are all over the place about this. And I'm just curious, because you're obviously immersed in all this, what you think.
Yeah. So I can tell you AI will have some impact for sure. I personally don't think the vast majority of the AI is going to have an impact within the next 5 years. I think it's going to be a little bit longer. But I do think a lot of the layoffs now are not even necessarily in relation to AI, it's in relation to a lot of other factors. One of them is like, we're still a lot of these organizations, they overhired a lot during the pandemic, and they're trying to like stabilize that to a certain degree. I also think for a lot of them, they're looking for quick wins with shareholders where they couldn't make necessarily progress in the last year. So a way to kind of appease shareholders is with layoffs. Unfortunately, it kind of affects the bottom line and the stock price, and so they see that as a win. With Meta, for example, and Microsoft. These are similar to layoffs that happened even pre-pandemic, where it was like, "Hey, we're house cleaning the bottom 3-5% that are not necessarily performing at a level that we'd want them to perform at." Maybe they were on pips, or maybe they were on the verge of being on a pip, but they just said, "Hey, this layoff is just going to be an easier way to kind of navigate that." I do think shareholding is a big factor into some of this, if I'm being completely honest. But because even what's funny is some of these companies did layoffs and they have hiring posts up right now, and I mean, I literally saw the same day that they announced layoffs. Quite a few people on Twitter were even sharing, "Hey, I just got hired," and now they're doing layoffs. It's like they were nervous, like, what's going to happen to me? But they realized like they kind of announced it's the bottom 5%. It's not favorable. It's not great. And one thing that I'll say is, for years I've kind of said you have to work hard, especially if you want to change the circumstances of your life, right? Like if you're coming from a background that is non-technical and you're trying to go into a technical role, you have to work your behind off in order to make that happen. It's unfortunate, but it's true, especially changing circumstances. A lot of people on the internet were not favorable to that. They said that it was a like hustle mindset and things like that. But the reality is you have to work hard. And now the same people that were somewhat critical of that are now having to work hard in order to maintain the things that they've had. You can only coast so long in this market, particularly. This is probably the most competitive market that I've seen for tech. But to be honest with you, my take on this is a little different as well. Like, I don't necessarily know. It's definitely the most competitive that we've seen for tech, but it's kind of met the expectations of almost every other industry around. Like, I've never seen an accountant that was like, "Oh, I just breezed through that interview. Like, I told them I knew what a spreadsheet was and they were hiring me." Like, they always had to advocate for their skills. They always had to kind of negotiate and talk and network and all these things. And I often give this example that if you go to the business side of a college, they are preaching your network, you have to have conversations. Your network is your net worth. It's going to open doors for you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When it goes to the computer science side of the colleges, they just brush past that topic. And so for a lot of software developers, this is the struggle that they're faced with now. They've never had to advocate for their skill set before. They've never really had to truly like go in there and prove that they know what they know outside of like a technical assessment. But like within the conversations, they've never had to like really push. And so this being the first time that a lot of them are doing that, they're thrown back by it. And it's definitely changed what the average developer trying to break in looks like, or the average developer that is trying to strive looks like. You have to be very technical and own your skill set in such a way that like you know what you're talking about. But there, all the other skills come into play too, especially communication. Like you have to be able to win those interviews and conversations, and you need to start being more mindful of your approach. Like you can't just go in like you used to and wing it and hope that things would work out okay. Like there has to be a strategy that you're employing to do well. Otherwise, someone else will. Because I can tell you right now, at this Labs, even like we post a job that we're hiring, we don't even post it on a career board. I made a LinkedIn post. You're talking about within the day we had 900 applications. But you know what? Maybe 30 were worth having a conversation with. And I feel like I'm very forgiving on a lot of this stuff. Like I totally see where people are coming from. I try to see the bigger picture, but so many are barely even doing the bare minimum when they apply because they look at it as a checkbox item that I'm like, man, if I call this person right now, I don't know what we would talk about. I don't know what I would ask. And so just because you have a couple years of experience, what are we supposed to take from that? Like, I don't even know what you contributed to specifically on the projects that you were on. And I'm seeing this every single day. Like, you can't just tell me you worked on the homepage. What does that even mean? Like, what did you work on? Like, what was the quantification of that? Like, did you see some impact? You worked on it for 4 years, that one thing? Like, there has to be more there, but you haven't told me anything. So what am I supposed to say? Like, hey man, saw that you worked on this homepage. Can you tell me about that? Like, no, I need something of more substance. So be very intentional with how you're presenting yourself and what you're giving people to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, one of the advice in terms of, I mean, yeah, quantifying your results and showing kind of the outcomes and so on at every single stage in terms of writing the resume and so on. The thing that's interesting is people trying to sort of quantify their work with AI. I mean, when people are using chatbots and so on and using prompt engineering, so I've been seeing a lot more of people showing that they're effective at prompt engineering. Like, they're not just sort of giving into AI and sort of like being like, oh, there's AI over here. People are trying to kind of get on top of it and just be like, okay, like I can effectively use AI to code and to supplement and make myself a faster developer and so on. I think that's very inspiring too, that people are seeing this technology, however disruptive it is, and then using that to sort of advance their careers and say, like, I'm here to meet this moment. I can use AI to like make myself a faster developer or, kind of a more effective team member. I think I'm inspired by it personally.
Yeah, I have a take on this where I feel like the interview process is going to evolve. And I think that there's going to have to be at some stage a test on AI. And what I mean by that is almost like you share your screen, they give you a task, and they're vetting how you utilize the AI tooling. Because I think in 2025, I don't want to say ignorant, but very foolish to assume that any dev has not touched any form of AI in any way, shape, or form. Like, it's impossible to assume that now. And so if you know at some stage that they're going to be interacting with AI and they're going to be utilizing it for tasks that you're giving them as a developer, you should be vetting how they're utilizing it. So for me, I would want to see how they are prompting. And when they get a result, what are they doing with it? Are they actually vetting the response? Or is it like a copy and paste, throw it in there, see if it works? Oh, it don't work, and they throw it back. Because for me, I would want to see if they're vetting it, like to actually see like, hey, does this actually work for the thing that I'm trying to solve? Because the other thing is, how do you know the quality of code that you're copying is actually worth copying and putting into enterprise level application? What vulnerabilities are you leaving us open to by copying this random snippet that it's providing without checking for additional context? Or are you even creating tests around this to ensure that the quality of response is worth inputting or at least protecting us as an organization? These are things that I'd want to see them utilize. And so if you're not doing that as an employer, I think it's almost a very foolish move not to vet that, especially at this stage. And I could totally see that being part of it as we go forward and evolve.
Well, that was a fascinating discussion. Here's some quick takeaways from Danny that you can use on your own job journey. First, de-risk yourself as a candidate. I love the phrase de-risk. When seeking a new tech role, especially your first, focus on minimizing the perceived risk for potential employers. Think of yourself as an investment. Companies prefer safe bets with clear returns. Showcase your abilities and accomplishments to demonstrate your value and make them want to take the chance on you. Don't just state your skills, prove them. Second, strategically craft your resume and your online profiles. Your resume and your online profiles aren't just checklists, they're marketing tools. Think strategically about the narrative you want to convey. What conversations do you want to spark with a hiring manager or a recruiter? What impression do you want to leave with them? Tailor the information to highlight your strengths and guide the interviewer towards the topics where you excel. Remember, there are many recruiters and hiring managers who form their initial impressions and then develop the interview questions based on whatever you've given them. Third, master the first interview. Many tech professionals focus on the technical interviews but overlook the initial screening. This first interview, which is often with a recruiter or an HR representative who might not necessarily have a tech background, is crucial. Learn to articulate your technical achievements in a way that resonates with non-technical individuals. Focus on demonstrating your soft skills, like communication and problem solving, through your interactions and your examples. Make the interviewer enthusiastic about your potential so that they advocate for you in subsequent rounds. Next, adapt and thrive in a competitive environment, which, is easier said than done, but it's crucially important. The tech job market, as you know, is highly competitive. While AI might have some impact in the long run, current layoffs are primarily driven by other factors such as overhiring, shareholder pressures, and performance reviews. Don't be discouraged, though. Focus on continually developing your skills, networking effectively, and showcasing your value. Just as professionals in other industries have always needed to advocate for themselves, tech professionals must now do the same. Embrace that challenge and demonstrate your unique value proposition. We covered a lot more during the discussion, which was fun, so please give it another listen if you missed anything. We'll see you next time, and remember, Dice is your best resource to find the tech talent you need to fill your open roles, and for tech pros, the best place to grow your tech career.